Hello and welcome to another in our series of videos on the philosophy of editing comic books. I'm Marvel editor Tom Brevoort, and as I've discussed in previous chapters of this series, this is all based on a talk that I give at Marvel every year to our junior editors to kind of distill a whole bunch of ideas down to them that we want to be able to pass on from generation to generation. Now I'm going to give that knowledge to you. So let's dive right into it. Picking up where we left off last time in terms of what the editor does and what the responsibilities of the editor are and what the concerns of the editor should be, I think that a big important point to make if you're going to be an editor is this: make no enemies. And that's a lot harder sometimes than it sounds, simply because as the editor, you're the person who's been empowered by whoever owns the material that you're working on, whether it's a big company like a Marvel or a DC, or whether it's creator-owned. You tend to be the bad guy. You tend to be the guy that's telling people no and not letting them do things that they want to do. But even those exchanges can be handled, hopefully, in a respectful and mindful sort of way, without you just being a pushover and letting people get away with whatever they want to do, regardless of whether it's in the best interests of the series you're working on or the characters you're working on. But it's a truism in this business that it doesn't really pay to carry a grudge, because you never know where somebody is going to end up in relation to yourself in the years to come. For example, right this moment over at DC, Marie Javins is the editor-in-chief. I worked with Marie when she was at Marvel back in the 90s, and I can tell you absolutely that nobody during that period would have said, yep, Marie Javins, she's going to be the editor-in-chief at DC Comics in a bunch of years. Not that she wasn't thought of well, but that nobody had any inkling that she was going to have that position. And so any interactions that they had with her back in the day or over the years, that may color her opinion of them now at a time when the situation is different. The same thing is true over at Marvel. Marvel's current editor-in-chief is C.B. Cebulski. And even only a few years ago, a decade ago, nobody would have thought, oh, that's the guy that's going to be the editor-in-chief. He mostly wasn't working in editorial at all. He was working with our talent division and doing stuff overseas and so forth. And so you never know where people are going to turn back up in your life and in your career, especially since comic books tends to be a fairly lifetime vocation. So for most people who get into the industry, we tend to stay in the industry long term. And the person who seems like a lower level peon at the moment may turn out to be an almighty overlord tomorrow. So if you have any say in the matter in terms of how you deal with people, make no enemies. There is no benefit to you in the long run. As an editor, if you are doing the easiest thing all the time, you are probably not doing the job correctly. I tell the younger editors that editing is active and that monkeys push paper. You have to be involved in the books that you're editing. You need to be reading everything as it comes in. You need to be commenting to whatever degree there are comments to be made constantly. And you need to be in charge and have a point of view on the work that you're dealing with. Back in the day, and I'm not going to name the individual in question, but back in the day at Marvel, there was an editor who would routinely, and I saw them do this many a time, would hire somebody on a given assignment based on who happened to walk into his office at that moment. That's not a terribly engaged editor, and that's not an editor that's really getting the best out of the material and putting the best together for the readers. You know, there are times when the best thing for an editor to do is nothing at all, but in general, the editor has to be an active participant in the act of creation. Otherwise, there's really no point in you being there, and you're probably creating more damage and more havoc than you're solving. There are 3 steps towards taking over a new project and bringing it to fruition. And those 3 steps are simply, number 1, understand the mission. Number 2, accept the mission. Number 3, accomplish the mission. That having been said, the first point, understand the mission, is critical. And this is the point early in the game when a project is first being talked about. You need to understand not just what you're doing. If somebody were to come to you and say, we want to launch a speedball series, edit the speedball series, it's important that you understand not just we want to launch a speedball series, but why a speedball series is being launched. We want to launch a speedball series because we have a speedball toy coming up, or there's some interest in a speedball film, or we have a take on speedball that we think is really interesting, or this key creator has a great speedball idea that we want to see if we can make fly. Whatever the thing is, you need to understand the mission, what it is you're trying to accomplish. And in terms of that speedball book, that may mean, is the organization looking for this to sell 1 million copies, or is the organization looking for this to sell solidly and be a contributor to the overall publishing line at the level that it's at? The better you understand the mission, the better you're able to carry it out. This is also the part of the conversation where you're able to kind of argue with people. Not every idea that's presented to you or project that's thrown your way is going to be to your taste or to your liking. So this is the point where it's okay to say and argue back, should it be Speedball? Maybe there's a better character. Maybe it should be a Darkhawk series, because these things that you want to accomplish would be more readily accomplished with Darkhawk. And maybe that key creator isn't the right person to be doing this. Would we be better off with this creative team instead? Or should we make Speedball's costume red instead of blue, because I feel like it would pop better in a red? Whatever the ideas that you have, whatever parts of the mission are bothersome to you or raise questions, this is the time to get answers to those questions and reach some sort of consensus. Because there is a point where the switch needs to flip and you need to move to the second part of the operation, which is accept the mission. There are going to be times when you are editing in an organization of any size where whatever the call is, it's not going to be precisely what you would have done. And there is a part of that process where it is absolutely imperative that you argue your point and argue it as passionately and vociferously and effectively as you can. But ultimately, like in a baseball game, once the umpire has made a call, once the decision is made, this is what we're doing, you as the editor need to pivot and commit yourself to whatever the mission actually is. So if it's going to be Speedball and it's going to be with that creative team and his costume is staying blue, at a certain point it's time to get on with the job of making the best blue costume Speedball project by those creators that you can make, and time to let the question of should the costume be red and should somebody else be writing or drawing it go away. You have to commit to what you're doing. Because at that point, you are the guardian of that project, at least internally, but even externally, and you have to carry it all the way to completion. Editor Steve Wacker had a phrase for this idea that I've stolen from him, but I try to give credit to him for it, which is, if you can't get out of it, get into it. Which is to say, if you can't argue your point to people and can't make them buy into whatever it is you're selling, it's time to go whole hog in on whatever the thing is and commit yourself to carrying out the mission. Finally, I want to talk a little bit about the editor-assistant editor relationship. At most big companies, individual editors work with an assistant who tends to be a younger editor, less experienced. It's a more entry-level position, assistant editor, and they're working their way up. And it is part of the editor's responsibility to mentor that person and to shepherd them, give them guidance, give them the opportunities to expand their editorial skills, give them valuable experience, make sure they don't do anything too terrible or dramatic to the publishing line, and put them into a position where they can become the editors of the future. The way I think of this when it comes to my editorial office, and the most effective way I've had in terms of doing this with people, is I view it as being akin to two cops on the beat in a patrol car together. Typically in the cliched version of this, you've got the old griddled veteran and the young rookie. But that's the thing. It's the same job for both people, and they work side by side, hand in hand, Your assistant editor is your partner, and your editor is your partner if you're an assistant editor. You function as one. You speak hopefully out to the creators and everybody else with more or less the same voice, even if you might disagree on a point internally to one another, and you function as a well-oiled team. In my methodology, I want the assistant editor on any book that I am working on to feel the same ownership of that book and that material that I do, and to make choices that have a positive impact on the story and the series. I want them to develop relationships with the talent that's working on those titles, so that both in that moment they can make the work we're doing better, and in the long term they can have those relationships to draw upon when it's time for them to be heading up their own titles and need to staff them with creators. I've been doing this job a very long time at this point, and I'm not afraid of the skills of any assistant editor. So I want my junior editors to be able to speak their mind to me. If they feel something about a line of dialogue, the way a scene is handled, the way a character is handled, the way something is being developed, the way a piece of art is done, some baffling idea that I've come up with, I want them to be able to speak their mind, and I want them to be able to convince me of the rightness of their position. There's a phrase that we use in my office, which is, if I'm not convinced, it's because you didn't convince me. And that openness to the opinions of the people that you're working with is, I think, crucial. I've had assistant editors over the years who've effectively made a lot of choices in the creation of these projects themselves, to the point where they feel such ownership of them, they'll talk about them now like they did everything on them. And that's great. They should feel that. And they did make those contributions. But all of it is ultimately under the aegis of the editor who is guiding them. In the end, in a straight-up gunfight between an assistant and the editor is going to win. Their opinion is going to be primary, but just because you have that power and that authority doesn't mean you should throw it around casually. You want your junior editors to contribute to what's going on and to make an impact on the book. Assistant editors need to be able to do the bad as well as the good. So under controlled conditions, you want to give them that opportunity. Probably the worst thing there is for anybody to have to do in an editorial capacity is to fire somebody, especially when it's somebody that you don't particularly want to fire, but the situation calls for it for one reason or another. And that's not something that I would hand off necessarily to an assistant editor, but I would let the assistant editor be involved in that process and at least watch and observe and learn from the way I communicate that kind of bad news to a creative team and how I handle the throw in that. You need to let them do every part of the job, not just the easy parts, and certainly not just the parts that involve moving pages or these days files from one place to another. Most of that is going to be the bulk of their day, because somebody has to keep the machinery of the office running. But you want them to be able to contribute on a content basis and on a creativity basis as well. Also, every assistant editor is different, and every editor-assistant editor relationship is different. So figuring out and finding what your junior editors are good at is important in terms of being able to guide their development. And if there's something that they're excellent at, let them do it. Give them as much of it as you can to take advantage of that. And if there are things that they're not particularly strong at, those are areas where you have to fill in the slack and slowly build them up so that they're able to function in that capacity at an excellent level. Over the years, I've had assistants who have been primarily artists, and so I've tended to let them A, interact with our artists more directly, and B, come up with more visual components, do cover sketches, do costume design, come up with visual ideas, while I handle more of the writer and story end. With other assistants, they have a more literary bent, or they're more social, or they're really good at spelling. Whatever it is that they can do well and easily, you want to give them the opportunity to use that, because that all works in your own benefit as well. Because the editor and the assistant editor is a team package, everything that goes out is under both your names, and anything that they do well reflects on you. Anything that they do poorly or you let them foul up is on you as well. So you got to be there to backstop them when you're getting into this stuff. That's about it for this time. We'll be back again with another of these videos shortly. Thanks a lot for being there. Take care.